A group of expat workers were joking and laughing on a rented bus in Saudi Arabia, totally oblivious to where the driver had taken them. Then, someone looked out the window. The chatter stopped dead. Panic set in. They were exactly 2 blocks from the Grand Mosque of Medina. For a Muslim, this is one of the holiest sites on earth. For this bus full of non-Muslims, it was a strictly forbidden zone. In a country that is 100% Islamic, wandering into these sacred city limits as a non-believer is a serious violation. The Western women on board frantically grabbed scarves to cover their hair and faces, trying to disappear into the seats. Someone lunged toward the front, pleading with the driver to kill the interior cabin lights before they were spotted. They had flown 400 kilometers out of Jeddah to avoid a long weekend drive, planning to land in Medina and take a bus straight north into the desert. But the airport shuttle system had failed 5 of their friends, and the remaining 15 had unknowingly hired a driver whose only route was a loop between the airport and the forbidden city center. They managed to convince the driver to cut the lights and get them out of the city limits safely that night. But the tension of that modern religious border was a fitting introduction to their destination, an ancient city that the local culture has intentionally shunned for centuries. After driving hundreds of kilometers north, the terrain shifts into a landscape of towering, rust-colored rock formations. This is Medain Saleh. This is the sister city to Petra in Jordan. It was carved out of the sandstone by the same Nabatean civilization roughly 2,000 years ago, using the same Greco-Roman influences to mark their desert empire. Over 100 intricately carved sandstone tombs populate this sprawling desert metropolis, their detailed facades rising directly out of the barren sand. The most striking structure is Qasr al-Farid, a massive tomb carved from a single isolated boulder. It stands 4 stories tall, but the base remains rough and blocky. The work was abandoned before the stonecutters could finish the final details. While millions of people visit Petra every year, Medain Saleh sits in near total isolation, largely devoid of the global tourism that its sister city enjoys. The isolation is a choice. In Arabic, Medain Saleh means Saleh city, and to the people living in the region today, it is considered a cursed place. Local religious tradition discourages people from visiting. The author's own Sally boss told him that if he visited the ruins, he should weep out of respect, and if he couldn't find real tears, he should fake them. Inside the tombs, the atmosphere matches the reputation. Narrow slots carved into the walls still hold the space where bodies once lay, and visitors describe a heavy, distinct smell of death that still lingers in the stagnant air. Ancient stone plaques provide the only context for the dead, displaying original Nabatean inscriptions that identify the owners and the deities meant to protect them. This leaves Medain Saleh as a masterpiece of human history that is intentionally feared and marginalized by the very society that lives alongside it. Throughout the ruins, there is a consistent pattern of damage on the monuments. The carved stone eagles that adorn the tomb entrances have almost all had their heads systematically destroyed. This wasn't the result of time or erosion. Subsequent groups of people misunderstood the Nabatean religious symbols and chose to smash what they didn't comprehend. The guide at the site called this the work of ignorant people, not meaning they lacked intelligence, but that they lacked the education to see value in a culture different from their own. The panic on the bus in Medina and the decapitated eagles of Medain Saleh both illustrate the same reality. When a landscape is carved into rigid cultural boundaries, the result is a history defined by friction, where anything that falls on the wrong side of the line is viewed as a threat to be avoided or erased. For all the different cultures and religions that have walked this planet, history shows there is more than one path through life. By choosing to research and understand these different paths, we can move past a world of forbidden zones and defaced monuments toward one that values our shared human legacy. Jeddah is a dense grid of coastal commerce and modern architecture, defined by the constant, high-energy hum of an urban center. Moving east, the city limits eventually dissolve into the silent, open expanses of the desert. The terrain here transitions into vast fields of blackened basalt. It is a harsh, horizontal landscape of volcanic craters, entirely devoid of the hills or peaks you would expect to see in a mountain range. In the middle of this flat volcanic waste, a single geological feature rises abruptly from the plain. This lone peak is composed of marble and sedimentary rock, a sharp physical contrast to the dark lava fields surrounding its base. Beyond its rare geology, the mountain is defined by an unsettling, frozen-in-time human footprint. At the foot of the mountain, the natural desert gives way to an industrial graveyard. Massive mining equipment sits exposed to the elements. A rusted crane, at least 50 years old, stands perfectly still against the desert wind. Worker lodgings remain at the base, built by hand from the mountain's own rocks and stones, the remnants of a once permanent settlement. There is a total absence of life here. The presence of massive infrastructure paired with absolute silence creates a deeply strange, abnormal atmosphere. Every piece of heavy investment suggests the workers simply vanished in the middle of a shift. The quarry faces are jagged and severely unfinished, showing where the extraction process was interrupted. A massive slab of marble sits near the foot of the mountain, left exactly where it was placed decades ago. There are no signs of a planned decommissioning. No equipment was packed, no tools were moved. Operations halted without warning, leaving the machinery to rust. The evidence at the site points toward a sudden discovery that rendered the work pointless. Local accounts suggest that the quality of the marble eventually proved too poor for commercial use. Once the stone was deemed worthless, the heavy investment in the site became an immediate sunk cost. The mountain's central flaw, its notably low-quality stone, is the only reason it was spared from total industrial consumption. Away from the scarred rock and rusted iron, a different kind of life has taken hold. On the left side of the mountain, a beautiful wadi winds through the boulders, a dry riverbed that provides a natural corridor for desert life. Local geckos and lizards move through the stones, and herds of camels pass through the area regularly. At the bottom of the wadi lies a Bedouin camp, a human presence that remains far more enduring than the mining camp ever was. While the rigid machinery of industry failed to conquer the mountain, the adaptable life of the nomads continues alongside it. The peak is often defined by brooding weather patterns, as ominous clouds gather over the solitary height of the mountain. On the journey back to the city, rare rainbows sometimes appear over the desert, marking the transition from the mountain back to the coast. This combination of ruins and isolation has made Marble Mountain a unique retreat for those looking to ease the tensions of city life. It stands as a monument to human failure that has inadvertently become a natural success, a quiet sanctuary where time and industry both stand still. Halfway between the cities of Jeddah and Riyadh, the flat horizon of the Saudi Arabian desert is broken by a sprawling field of extinct volcanoes. It is here the ground suddenly disappears, giving way to the Wahba Crater, a mile-wide gap that seems to appear out of nowhere. To anyone standing on the edge, the explanation seems obvious. The circular shape and the sheer scale look exactly like the result of a massive meteorite slamming into the desert. But the geology tells a different story. If nothing fell from the sky, we have to look toward the deep earth to explain how this massive void was carved out of solid rock. Understanding the origin of this crater requires more than a view from the rim. You have to experience the true depth of its vertical drop. From the top, the perspective is deceptive. It is only when you spot hikers at the bottom, shrunk to pinpricks against the vast salt pan, that the true scale becomes clear. To find the truth, we have to leave the rim behind and begin a grueling, hours-long descent through the rock layers to the crater floor. This vertical path acts as a journey backward in time, where each meter of descent reveals a new layer of the landscape's violent history. The descent begins at the ash cone, where the footing is treacherous and the loose debris makes every step a calculated risk. The presence of this cone and the surrounding fields of black volcanic debris provide the physical evidence that this hole was forged by heat from within the earth, not an impact from space. Millions of years ago, a massive plume of magma rose toward the surface, pushing through the thick layers of the Earth's crust. When that superheated magma struck a massive underground body of water, the result was a violent reaction. The water was instantly flash vaporized, creating a pocket of extreme high-pressure steam. The pressure built until it shattered the surface in a catastrophic blowout, ejecting millions of tons of rock and leaving behind the mile-wide cavity we see today. Wahba is not a scar left by a visitor from space, but a vent created by a massive underground explosion. Continuing the descent, the transition into the bowl is accompanied by a sudden, heavy rise in temperature. Despite the heat, an ecological anomaly appears along the walls. Small, lush groves of palm trees somehow manage to cling to the steep upper trails. This greenery is a brief distraction from the punishing reality of the hike. Down here, the air is stagnant, and the sheer volume of water required to survive the trek highlights the hostility of the environment. Navigating the steep, treacherous trail takes 2.5 hours, each step requiring total focus as the heat distortion blurs the path ahead. The struggle to reach the bottom makes the scale of the original explosion tangible. Every punishing meter of the trail represents rock that was once blasted away in an instant. Reaching the floor brings you into an entirely alien landscape, standing at the center of the ancient blast zone. Walking here creates a jarring sensory paradox. The ground crunches loudly under your feet, and the visual of the white expanse is so convincing that it feels like you're walking on frozen snow. This snow is actually a massive salt pan. Its brilliant white, crystalline floor stretches across the entire bottom of the crater, creating a sharp contrast with the dark volcanic walls. This freezing white illusion, sitting at the bottom of a sweltering heat trap, is the final deception of the Wahba Crater. Local folklore offers a different explanation for the white floor, rooted in the belief that a massive lake once filled this space. The legend says the lake eventually decided it didn't like the desert, so it packed up and moved south to Yemen. While the myth is whimsical, the geological reality is just as dramatic. Water really was the defining ingredient in this landscape, not as a peaceful lake, but as a destructive force. The crunching salt pan is the mineral signature of that ancient water, left behind after it was flash vaporized by the rising magma. The Wahba Crater stands as a reminder of the volatile, explosive power that sits just beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for the right moment to break through. It's January 1999, right at the end of Ramadan. A week-long holiday called Eid al-Fitr has emptied out the offices in Saudi Arabia as foreign workers fly home, but I decided to stick around. What started out as a heavily planned 6-person convoy quickly thinned out. By Sunday morning, it was just 3 of us, packing into 2 4x4s and aiming north toward the remote desert. The initial 400-kilometer push from Jeddah to Medina is a remarkably dull ride. It's a wide, 3-lane paved highway carving through a barren landscape that feels a lot like driving across Texas or Nevada. But that smooth infrastructure is a veneer. Right at the edge of the asphalt sits a much older, more violent landscape. To reach the actual history of the Northern Hejaz, you have to drive off the map entirely. When you reach the first off-run waypoint at Medina, the 20th century starts to peel back. This map shows the route of the old Turkish Hejaz Railway. Publicly, it was billed as an infrastructure project built to bring religious pilgrims down from Istanbul. But if we look at how it operated, a different motive emerges. The Ottoman Empire had occupied Saudi Arabia for 400 years, and this track gave them a discrete, high-speed channel to project troop strength directly into the desert. They engineered the line for defense. Every 20 kilometers along the tracks, you hit a water tower and a stone fort built to hold 25 armed men. These forts operated under a strict security protocol. Whenever a train departed, operators would telegraph the next station down the line. That receiving station then started a precise 15-minute countdown. If the train failed to arrive within that tight window, the commanding officers assumed an attack was underway and immediately deployed cavalry. That intense security was necessary because local Bedouin tribes viewed the railway as a direct threat to their way of life, and they relentlessly sabotaged the railway line. Those localized tribal raids eventually merged into a much wider theater of war, drawing the direct attention of the West through the guerrilla campaigns of T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. The Hejaz Railway functioned as a heavily fortified military frontline, pushing deep into a desert that refused to be conquered. Leaving the railway behind means plunging into terrain where the roads disappear entirely. We navigated down a steep, rocky ravine, putting the 4x4 vehicles to an absolute test as we crept over the loose boulders. At the bottom sits the massive Khaybar Dam, a historic structure that rewinds the clock back roughly 2,000 years to an era local legend ties to the Queen of Sheba. It is a massive, highly sophisticated piece of stone engineering. No one holds the exact blueprints, and its true age remains a complete mystery. Today, half of that enormous ancient stone wall lies in ruins, blown out by centuries of immense, unrelenting water pressure. If you look at this cross-section of the site, you can see the engineering logic at work. These arrows map out how the builders captured flash floods and diverted the water outward, hoping to irrigate the surrounding barren land for heavy farming. Whether it was ancient engineers commanding the water or Ottoman troops laying down steel tracks, heavily armed empires repeatedly arrived in the deep northern Hejaz to tame it. Both ultimately left their structures in ruins. We set up camp near the base of the collapsed dam. Down in the ravine, shaded by acacia and palm trees beside a small flowing creek, the modern highway feels thousands of miles away. Saudi Arabia remains a tightly closed country, which means its archaeological sites rarely look like tourist attractions. There are no plaques, no guided tours, and no velvet ropes. Standing there forces you into the role of an active Imagineer. You have to climb the embankments, decipher the dry irrigation channels, and reconstruct the logic of the people who cut those stones. The active, investigative challenge of uncovering a forgotten historical narrative provides the ultimate reward of this expedition. And while day one ended quietly under the stars, we were only at the beginning of a 6-day expedition. By tomorrow, our carefully planned isolation was going to fall apart. This map traces our route out of the safety of the city and straight north into the Hejaz Desert. Our first stop is the old village of Khaybar. Years ago, the government ordered every resident to relocate to a newly built town nearby, instantly turning a thriving oasis into an empty ghost town. Walking through the quiet center feels strange. Unmaintained, the mud and stone buildings are slowly collapsing under their own weight, dissolving back into the earth. Right in the middle of the village sits an imposing acropolis. While anyone can wander the town, approaching the central structure requires special government clearance. From a distance, the acropolis looks like a building perched on a natural hill, but if you look closely at the texture where the jagged rock stops and the mud begins, you catch the deception. At one time, this was a Jewish fort. The builders constructed the walls one layer at a time, then packed the entire exterior with mud to camouflage the massive structure against the horizon. The inhabitants of Khaybar succeeded by turning the landscape itself into their primary defense. Pushing further north, the empty ruins fall away as we hit Taima, a vibrant, heavily populated oasis. Taima thrives today because of the Bir Hadash. It is an active, massive water well that has been pumping life into the settlement for 25 centuries. This ancient script from the biblical book of Isaiah explicitly names the town as Taima, establishing an unbroken historical timeline of human settlement here. We arrived during the Eid holiday. Young Saudis walked ancient stone pathways wearing crisp white thobes, creating a sharp contrast against the weathered masonry. Unlike the restricted silence of Khaybar, the locals here were eager to bridge the gap, immediately volunteering to be our tour guides around the well for free. Taima demonstrates that human habitation here is a result of the relentless maintenance of deep water infrastructure. Moving from the well into the shade of the date palm oasis, we were approached by a local chieftain. Wearing the traditional black robes that mark local authority, he immediately offered us genuine hospitality, inviting us into his home for tea. We had to do some quick cultural calculus. Accepting the tea would likely obligate us to stay for a roasted lamb feast, eating up an entire day. We politely refused, knowing we were delivering a necessary insult to keep our schedule. Down the road, this wide shot captures an abandoned Turkish fort. Its imposing circular corner towers highlight the massive scale of these foreign military outposts. But stepping inside, the reality of the structure sets in. The dark stone passageways are totally abandoned, echoing with squeals and blanketed heavily in back guano. The silent rooms of the Turkish fort stand as a contrast to the thriving town nearby, showing that while stone walls can be built anywhere, they only last as long as the people who maintain them. Leaving the paved highway behind, we drove 16 kilometers out into a wadi, a dry riverbed, to find a campsite. Without warning, the lead vehicle hit a patch of deep sand. Even shifted into low gear, the heavy tread spins rapidly, digging the vehicle deeper down into the earth. I hooked up a chain to try and tow the lead car out, but quickly lost traction myself. Suddenly, we had 2 vehicles completely stranded in an empty desert. This cross-section illustrates the physics of the trap. The spinning tire acts as an excavator, throwing sand backward until the metal chassis drops flat against the ground, creating absolute, unyielding friction. Modern 4-wheel drive engineering becomes entirely useless the moment the fundamental laws of weight distribution in loose sediment are ignored. The first step to getting out of a situation like this is psychological. You have to kill the panic and focus all your manpower on extracting a single car at a time. To beat the sinkhole, you use a specific mechanical trick. As this diagram shows, placing a flat rock under your jack spreads the heavy downward load across a wider area, preventing the tool from burrowing. Once the tire clears the hole, pack fresh sand underneath it, raising the chassis off the ground. It is a grueling process. Repeating this exact jacking and packing method for 3 different wheels took an hour and a half of intense physical labor. The reality of the Hejaz is that movement is a requirement. The moment you lose momentum, the sand begins the process of burying your presence. The plan was simple enough. We would drive north on the paved highway to the city of Tabuk, then trace the historic Hejaz railway line all the way back south to Medina. We were looking for the remnants of a century-old engineering marvel left to bake in the desert. But a few days before we set out, my travel partner, Craig, heard a rumor. He decided the direct paved route was entirely too safe and suggested we take a detour west, out into the sand. Our navigation system for this new route wasn't exactly state-of-the-art. We were relying on a crude, hand-drawn sketch with a vague dashed line pointing toward a small, isolated village called Adisa. The draw was a set of ancient Nabatean tombs. The rumor suggested they were carved straight into the sheer sandstone cliffs, mirroring the massive archaeological sites at Pecha. So right as we passed a lone gas station on the road to Duba, we cut the wheel. We left the highway behind and dropped down onto a heavily rutted dirt track. That single turn committed us to the terrain. We wouldn't see an inch of paved asphalt for another 200 kilometers. We traded a guaranteed, predictable itinerary for an unverified dashed line on a scrap of paper, leaving ourselves entirely exposed to whatever the Saudi desert had hiding off the map. 50 kilometers down the track, that hand-drawn map failed us. We drove straight through the main dirt strip of Disa without spotting a single ancient tomb. We even missed the designated campsite because the landmark, a cluster of dead trees, had apparently been removed. Continuing past the village, the landscape abruptly closed in. A massive, sheer escarpment of solid sandstone rose up, blocking the backside of the valley. Geographically, this wall shouldn't have been there. It sat squarely across the path we assumed would loop us back toward Tabuk, effectively turning our detour into a box canyon. But there was a strange inconsistency. Every few minutes, a local vehicle would drive directly toward us, emerging from the direction of the seemingly impassable rock wall. Trusting the flow of those oncoming cars over our own visual judgment, we pushed forward. We found a narrow fracture in the rock wall and drove our vehicle straight into a deep, hidden gorge, passing the point of no return. Once inside the gorge, the arid desert environment vanished. The dry, dusty dirt track quickly saturated into mud, and we found ourselves driving into an active, flowing waterway. The walls of the canyon tightened, flanked by thick reeds standing 10 feet tall. The passable space shrank down to a gap barely 3/4 of a car wide. There was no dry dirt shoulder to drive on. The track and the creek were the exact same thing. For the next several miles, we had to pilot the car directly through the flowing water, crawling over submerged sandbars, navigating thick mud and loose rocks. If the tires sank too deep into the wet sand, Or if we cracked an axle on a hidden boulder, our only rescue plan was to sit in the water and hope another local eventually came splashing down the canyon. The concept of a designated road had completely dissolved into the creek bed. We spent the next several miles managing traction and clearance in a flooded canyon, focused entirely on keeping the vehicle from sinking into the submerged sand. By evening, we managed to pull off the waterway into a small, deserted clearing tucked deep inside the high reeds. The loud, chaotic crunching of tires over river rocks gave way to the quiet isolation of our campfire. This is when Craig finally unpacked his real gear. Craig works for the U.S. Geological Service, and instead of relying on the crude, handwritten sketches, he rolled out a half-dozen detailed topographic maps and fired up a GPS receiver. By syncing with overhead satellites, he extracted our precise latitude and longitude, dropping a pin exactly where we sat inside the complex gorge system. With our location locked, he revealed his actual plan. He didn't want to slowly backtrack to Tabuk. He wanted to cut a straight path across the uncharted desert and physically intercept the Hejaz railway line. The math was tight. If this cross-country dead reckoning worked, we would emerge perfectly on schedule. If the terrain blocked us and we had to retreat to the asphalt of Tabuk, we would lose an entire day of travel. I told him I didn't care if I had to call out of work another day. I had zero interest in retreating to the highway when those abandoned rail cars were waiting somewhere out in the sand. The crude, handwritten map had led us into the mud, but the satellite data provided a trajectory out. We fell asleep with the target coordinates locked in, wondering only if the canyon's sheer walls would offer an opening when we started the engines. Squeezing a vehicle through a 15-kilometer gorge in the Saudi desert takes serious focus. When you finally finish punching out past those towering red rock walls, the relief is instant. You feel like the hardest part is behind you. Leaving the gorge, we had two options. One trail pointed straight toward our destination of Tabuk. The other looked like a clever cross-country shortcut straight to the historic railway line. We decided to take the shortcut. The environment pushed back immediately. The faint tracks in the dirt faded away entirely, and the sand beneath our tires grew noticeably softer and much deeper. A quick check of the maps confirmed the grim reality. The trails simply petered out into nothing. There was no way through, and backtracking to the main route was going to cost us an entire extra day. That initial relief exiting the gorge was completely misplaced. The landscape had laid a trap, offering an easy way out that only forced us onto a much more punishing path. Back on the main trail to Tabuk, the terrain shifted from deep sand to vertical rock. We had to ascend a towering escarpment on a narrow, winding dirt path. The trail was heavily rutted, leaving the rocky center raised dangerously high. Every few feet, the awful sound of jagged rocks bashing against my vehicle's exposed undercarriage echoed loudly through the cabin. To keep the oil pan intact, I had to adopt a bizarre driving style. Instead of staying centered, I straddled the high ground, keeping one side of the vehicle perched dangerously high on the extreme left or right edges of the ruts to lift the undercarriage clear. That technique protected the bottom of the car, but it sacrificed the tires. My vehicle wasn't running heavy-duty rock crawlers, and the jagged stones along the edges actively chewed and nibbled at the rubber the entire way up. We finally reached the summit. Standing up there, the isolation is absolute. There is no one else around for miles in any direction. The emptiness is so intense that my crewmate, Craig, stripped completely naked right there on the peak, simply to prove that he could. When a landscape fights you that hard for every inch of progress, it strips away any feeling of connection to the outside world. It creates a powerful illusion that you are the only human being left on the planet. That grand illusion lasted exactly until we started driving down the other side of the mountain. We rolled down the slope and immediately ran into a bustling group of Saudi locals. Some were driving pickup trucks, while 4 others were casually riding camels through the valley. It was a bizarre, serendipitous collision of worlds. We spent time taking pictures together, and they made sure to check on our survival logistics, pointing us toward Tabuk and asking if we had enough gas to make the trip. An invisible web of human activity and survival stretches across these dunes, remaining completely hidden until you stumble directly into its path. A few hours down the route, we pulled about 300 yards off the main dirt track to set up a quick, unremarkable stop for lunch. While we were getting the gear unpacked, Craig noticed something odd in the dirt. Scattered across this patch of sand were sharp fragments of flint and quartz, materials with no geological business being in this part of the desert. Then he looked at the layout. Embedded in the ground were 4 large stones arranged perfectly into a square. It was the foundation of an ancient, small hut. The quartz shards weren't random stones. They looked exactly like broken arrowheads scattered across an old floor. A closer inspection of the surrounding boulders provided the final proof. Etched directly into the stone were clear, distinct ancient carvings of human figures, horses, and camels. We were eating lunch in an ancient home. This landscape holds a deep, crowded history, proving that even a random patch of dirt is a potential doorway into the past. We packed up, pushed forward, and finally rolled into Tabuk. Our target now was the old Hejaz Railway. Abandoned railway lines don't get much tourist traffic here, so finding the access point took us an hour of searching. Once we found the entrance, we drove 50 kilometers down the decaying tracks, heading deep back into the desert to make camp alongside the ruins. Massive, skeletal steam locomotives sat rotting on the rails. These heavy iron engines were once the absolute pinnacle of modern transportation, and now they are rusting directly into the sand. That's the reality of traveling through the Northern Hejaz. It doesn't matter how remote the trail gets or how alone you feel on top of a mountain. You are always traveling in the exact footsteps of people who conquered this desert long before you did. By day 5 in the brutal Saudi desert, we were entirely off the grid and running a full 24 hours behind schedule. That delay created 2 pressing problems. We needed to let people know we were safe, and our vehicles desperately needed fuel. We had to reach the town of Al Ula. To get there, we had to push south from the Tabuk region and cover roughly 200 kilometers of open, hostile terrain. But we wouldn't be driving on a modern highway. Our path exactly mirrored the ghost of an ancient, destroyed railway. You can still find the hardware rotting right out in the open, with flatbeds and engines frozen in time on the sand. Driving the actual railbed is chaotic. The steel ties and rails are completely gone. Whole sections are totally washed out or buried under massive rock slides. In some spots, the desert has simply reclaimed the route, swallowing the raised bed beneath shifting sand dunes as high as 20 meters. It turned the route into a solid 5 out of 10 on the technical driving scale. One minute you're sprinting along a smooth section at 85 kilometers an hour, and the next you're locked in a punishing rocky crawl. Maintaining momentum required a jarring rhythm. We constantly had to jump off the elevated bed, drop down into deep sand to bypass obstacles, and then we had to violently climb back up. Despite the chaos of the drive, we found ourselves hitting the brakes roughly every 20 kilometers to investigate the remains of the old Ottoman infrastructure. We kept running into structures like this, a kalat. It's a small, isolated castle built with 4 distinct turrets, perched directly on the rocky hills. They were heavily engineered survival stations. Inside, they housed massive cisterns, storing the one resource required to keep this route operational. The engineers designed mechanical systems that utilized windmills to draw water from deep beneath the desert surface, constantly refilling the supply. These outposts are physical proof that surviving the Hejaz has always meant conquering its absolute scarcity. Those engineers were fighting the exact same battle for momentum and resources we were fighting today. As we finally closed the distance to Al Ula, the historical context of where we were heading began to shift. In the Bible, this ancient settlement is known as Dedan, and Dedan carries a heavy, ominous weight in the texts of both Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Those prophecies decreed total calamity. They warned of coming violence, dictating that the residents of Dedan would fall by the sword or be forced to flee deep into the wastes. The sheer hostility of the environment makes those ancient warnings feel tangible. Pushing through this desert feels like driving directly into a prophesied collapse. Late in the afternoon, the grueling 200-kilometer dirt gauntlet finally ended. We hit solid asphalt just 10 kilometers outside of Al Ula, but we never made those delayed phone calls. The moment we hit the pavement, our priorities shifted, entirely hijacked by the surrounding landscape. Huge sandstone monoliths tower over the valley floor, suddenly pulling the story away from human history and throwing you into deep geological time. It looks incredibly similar to Monument Valley. These massive, towering hills were slowly carved out eons ago as the ancient sea that once covered this entire region gradually subsided. Scattered among these formations are incredible places to set up camp, and we locked our sights on one colossal natural rock bridge, known as the Mammoth. Getting there meant surviving one last hurdle. The beautiful campsites directly beneath the arch are guarded by a treacherous, unforgiving expanse of deep, soft sand. We dropped it into low gear and pushed across. Conquering the Hejaz reveals a place where mechanical, biblical, and geological timelines violently intersect. With our camp finally secured beneath the sandstone, we were ready to see what Day 6 had waiting for us. Leaving Al Ula on Day 6, we packed up our gear, left the pavement behind, and drove into the open desert. This route map shows the logistical challenge of reaching Medina. It's a 350-kilometer trek, but only 150 kilometers of that is paved. The rest is a 200-kilometer stretch of raw, off-road driving. We could have taken modern highways the entire way and saved ourselves the trouble, but the modern roads bypass the exact terrain we came here to see. We wanted to track the ghost line of the Hejaz Railway, tracing a century-old path straight through the sand. To grasp Lawrence's strategy, you have to stand in the same ravines he used to hide his men and watch the horizon he scanned for smoke. Out here, history is a physical reality, etched into a deeply unforgiving landscape. As the last few miles of asphalt disappeared behind us, the isolation of the Northern Hejaz completely took over. During World War I, this region was occupied by the Ottoman Empire, a highly organized, modern military force relying on heavy infrastructure and massive troop deployments. Navigating this terrain today, you'll suddenly spot massive, unnatural shapes emerging from the dunes. We found the rusted shell of an Ottoman locomotive, still sitting right where Lawrence's forces derailed it a century ago. The local fighters didn't have heavy armor or massive supply chains. They had an inherited knowledge of the ravines, the heat, and the sand. These ruins are the physical remains of a friction between modern machinery and ancient terrain, proof that a massive empire's lifeline was vulnerable to a few well-placed charges in the sand. Our specific goal for the day was a peak called Jebel Antar. This cross-section shows why that mountain mattered, providing a vantage point directly over the railway. Lawrence watched the trains roll through the valley to calculate their speeds. He used that data to plan his ambushes, waiting for the perfect intersection of time and place. We wanted to climb that exact mountain to see the view for ourselves, but the 200 kilometers of off-road driving quickly ground down our momentum. The rough track finally forced us to stop driving, leaving us stranded about 50 kilometers short of Jebel Antar. Missing our target is a practical lesson in what Lawrence knew well. The distance and the heat are active participants in any mission here, dictating where you stop and how far you can push. So we abandoned the schedule and set up a makeshift camp exactly where the desert forced us to stop. It turned out to be the best campsite of the trip. We were situated right next to a massive sand dune resting entirely against a rocky hill. After pitching the tents, I decided to climb up the dune to the top of the rocks just as the sun started to drop. I was able to shoot the other side of the sand-covered mountain, catching the rocks glowing against the fading light. It's a good reminder. Whether you're an imperial train, a 20th century guerrilla fighter, or just a modern traveler trying to keep a schedule, the desert dictates the terms of the journey. This map plots the stark isolation of the Northern Hejaz relative to major Saudi population centers. On Day 7, we woke deep in this remote territory. Applying overnight temperature data reveals tight clusters of low thermal readings across the north. The air up here hovered near freezing. Pushing through those nights required heavy-duty sleeping bags and a steady campfire just to maintain body heat. There is a specific mental friction on the final morning of a trip like this. You are caught right in the middle of a transition, still needing the vigilance of surviving in the dirt, but already anticipating the relief of paved roads. The drive out from this location is a literal descent. We would spend the next several hours mapping a steep drop in latitude against a steady, undeniable rise in ambient temperature. But before modern infrastructure could completely absorb us, we needed to make one deliberate sweep through this unforgiving landscape. We broke camp early. Our immediate objective was to finish tracing the final scattered segments of an abandoned rail line cutting through the sand. The Hejaz Railway survives as a mechanical ghost. Built over a century ago, the tracks and rolling stock sit completely exposed, preserved by the arid climate and the sheer difficulty of reaching them. This captures the last train we found. A rusted steam locomotive and flat cars sit stationary, surrounded by eroded mountains, where they stopped decades ago. Leaving the tracks, we pushed our vehicles toward the dark slopes of Jebel Antar. Navigating the lower flanks, the sheer physical scale of the peak quickly dwarfed the trucks. Reaching the actual summit, however, would require abandoning the vehicles for a punishing 4-hour vertical hike up the rocks. The clock was running out. Our exit window dictated a strict schedule, and we simply did not have the buffer to accommodate a 4-hour detour. The math overruled the ambition. The hard limits of daylight and fuel always dictate the end of an expedition, forcing you back onto the designated exit route. This map tracks our departure from the mountains, aiming our compass firmly south as we began the long drive toward Medina. In a desolate environment like this, you expect to spend half your time dodging venomous wildlife. Yet over the entire week, we didn't cross paths with a single snake or scorpion. The biological footprint observed was incredibly subtle. We only spotted delicate mouse tracks across the sand. As the tracking line drops south, thermal data shifts aggressively. Those freezing northern pockets dissolve into rising heat as afternoon progresses. Inside the cabs of the trucks, the heavy thermal layers that kept us warm the night before became suffocating. We stripped off the cold weather gear piece by piece. The climbing temperature acts as a physical barometer. With every degree the thermometer rises, the severe isolation of the desert slips away, signaling an imminent return to the populated world. Look at the sheer density of Medina in this image. The empty dunes disappeared in an instant, replaced by thick clusters of walled buildings and towering minarets as we hit the city limits. Our tires finally hit smooth asphalt. The jarring, highly technical navigation of the backcountry immediately gave way to a standardized 3-hour highway commute. That long, predictable stretch of pavement serves a purpose. It gives the brain time to power down from high-alert survival mode and recalibrate to the simple, monotonous act of sitting in traffic. By the time we pulled into the commercial center of Jeddah, the wilderness was entirely erased by towering glass office buildings, paved city squares, and pedestrian crowds. Down here at sea level, as shown along this coastline, the climate had inverted. We stepped out of the trucks onto the beach right into perfect warm t-shirt weather. We had pushed through freezing nights, navigated trackless valleys, and managed extreme isolation without any major incidents. The defining feature of the Hejaz is its extreme geographic compression. You can wake up shivering next to untouched ruins, and by dinner time, be standing in the warm air of a modern coastal city. It was Thursday morning at 9 a.m., and we were sitting at a designated gas station just outside Taif, Saudi Arabia. A local natural history tour group was supposed to meet us here for a scheduled convoy into the desert. 10 minutes went by. The lot was entirely empty. We knew the group's exact routine, but they had clearly changed their itinerary without telling us. Instead of waiting around the gas station all morning, my friends Liz, Murphy, and I made a quick decision. We took the map, fired up the engine, and decided to push forward into the unknown by ourselves. We hit the pristine tarmac of the modern Riyadh Road. It's a massive, multi-lane corridor cutting straight through the sand. We cruised easily at normal highway speeds, right up until the occasional BMW or Mercedes would fly past us, pushing 200 kilometers per hour. To reach the old city of Muwayh, we had to leave that high-speed comfort behind. This map shows the exact point where the tarmac ends. From here, the instructions were simple. Set a compass bearing to exactly 335 degrees and drive 40 kilometers straight into the sand. Out here, scattered dirt tracks branch off in every possible direction. At every single intersection, you have to choose the path that most closely aligns with that 335-degree axis. One wrong turn, and you vanish into a web of dead ends. The highway is a straight line through the sand, designed to get you past the desert as quickly as possible. But the real geography, the one that isn't made of asphalt, begins the moment you turn the compass toward 335 degrees. Almost immediately, the physical environment tested us. The wind picked up fast, kicking sand across our field of vision. Whenever we stopped to check our coordinates, the gusts made it a physical struggle just to push the car doors open. Then out of the blowing sand, we spotted movement. We drove closer and found over 200 camels, stretching for hundreds of meters across the landscape. These are not wild strays wandering the dunes. A herd this size represents a mobile economy, carefully guided toward pens by a small crew of Sudanese herders walking right alongside them. The herders saw us taking pictures. Instead of shooing us away, they walked over and invited us to sit down for morning tea and breakfast. An hour ago, cars were blowing past us at highway speeds. Now, strangers were offering us their food. The highway is built on isolation, but out here, the herd is a community. The desert isn't a blank space on a map. It's a place where time slows down enough for a stranger to offer you a meal. After hitting our 40-kilometer mark, a square watchtower appeared on the horizon. We climbed to the top and looked out over Old Muwayh, a village of wood and mud brick houses that looked like they were melting back into the earth. But resting in the center of those crumbling homes stood a massive palace, built entirely out of dark volcanic rock, designed to withstand the centuries. That stone core was originally constructed as a major military outpost. For 400 years, Turkish soldiers used this fortress to maintain control over the surrounding Arabian territory. That imperial control finally broke during the Arab Revolt, when local Bedouin fighters, alongside figures like T.E. Lawrence, drove the Ottoman forces completely out of the peninsula. Following that victory, King Abdulaziz unified the country to form modern Saudi Arabia. He took this former military stronghold and converted it into a royal palace and hunting lodge. That hunting era had severe consequences, eventually driving several local species to extinction. To repair the damage today, animals like the ibex were brought over from the San Diego Zoo to repopulate protected wildlife habitats right here in the Saudi desert. This cluster of volcanic rock is a geological record of the last few centuries. You can read the history of military occupation, political revolution, and ecological repair, all layered within the walls of one building. While we were walking through the ruins, a Toyota pickup truck suddenly pulled up. A Bedouin man stepped out of the driver's seat, pulled out a shotgun, and started walking directly toward us. To understand this moment, you have to know how weapons are handled in Saudi Arabia. The country maintains strict gun control. Handguns, for example, are legally restricted to the police force. There is a specific legal exception for nomadic tribes. The Bedouin are permitted to carry rifles because they rely on them to hunt for food in the harsh interior. We exchanged cautious greetings. Then, instead of telling us to leave, he cracked open the chamber, loaded a shell, handed me the 12-gauge, and insisted I take a shot at one of the mud walls. The kick made my shoulder ache for days, but I wasn't going to turn down the invitation. In the city, a stranger with a gun is a reason to run. Here, he's a father who shares his weapon as easily as he points the way to the local well. He wasn't guarding the ruins. He was welcoming us into them. Right after I took the shot, we looked over the horizon. The scheduled tour group had finally arrived. They drove slowly past us, looking bewildered as I stood smiling next to an armed Bedouin in the middle of nowhere. We eventually set our bibis and headed to the group campsite, where a sandstorm rolled in. It pulled tent stakes straight out of the ground, ripping apart sun shelters and filling the air with fine grit. But the turbulence didn't last. After dark, the winds died down, revealing a moonless sky blanketed by stars. The group finally came together around the main campfire. We ate dinner, passed around a guitar, and sang folk songs into the cold night. The tour group stuck to the tarmac and the 11 a.m. departure. They arrived in time to see the palace, but they missed the herders, all the camels, and the mud walls. They followed the road, but we followed the bearing.
When we picture Saudi Arabia, we imagine endless, blistering flatlands, a sea of sand baking under a harsh sun, tough but completely horizontal. But during a January holiday, I was stuck at sea level in coastal Jeddah. My usual trucking partners had left the country, and I wanted an off-road escape that went far beyond the city limits. Going into the backcountry here comes with one absolute rule: you never travel alone. The deep desert is unforgiving. If your engine dies in an isolated stretch, you might not make it out. So I teamed up with my friends Kamal and Mohammed. I brought the trekking books and the GPS gear. They brought something far more crucial: fluent Arabic. Surviving the remote stretches of the kingdom is rarely a solo act. It takes a deliberate mix of navigation tools to keep you on the map, and the right language skills to handle whoever or whatever you encounter out there. We pointed our trucks east toward Taif, hitting the twisting tourist road. We quickly left the coastal heat behind as the pavement angled sharply upward into the mountains. This chart shows exactly how extreme that climb is. We started at about 200 feet above sea level, but by the time we reached the region of Bani Saad, my GPS tracked us at a staggering 8,000 feet. Looking out over the edge, it was like finding a second Grand Canyon. A massive gorge dropped away into a cloudy mist, and the wind was howling. It was absolutely freezing. It completely shatters the illusion of a uniform, baking desert. Up at this altitude, heat exhaustion isn't the problem. Instead, you are hit with biting, icy winds that force you to find cover. And that is where the pavement runs out. To get to the valley floor, you have to commit to this narrow, barrier-free dirt track that practically falls right off the cliff edge. With daylight burning and temperatures dropping fast, staying at the summit wasn't an option. We knew it would be significantly warmer down at the bottom, so we had to drive straight down. Staring down a one-lane hairpin drop is mechanically terrifying. If you try to ride your standard brakes the whole way down, friction will cook them until they simply stop working. Navigating a slope this steep stops being about how well you can steer. It becomes a strict problem of physics. Specifically, how to manage an immense amount of downward momentum without losing control. This diagram shows the solution, a specialized off-road setting called 4-low. When a driver engages this, the drivetrain shifts into a configuration designed for maximum torque and minimal speed. Instead of fighting gravity at the wheels, 4-low uses the engine itself. The engine's internal compression acts as a mechanical anchor, creating heavy resistance that naturally absorbs the vehicle's downward speed. If you rely purely on standard brake pads for a drop this steep, the constant friction causes them to overheat, turn bright red, and fail entirely. The 4-low system stays stable and cool because it bypasses those pads altogether. We needed every ounce of that mechanical resistance. In exactly 1 hour, we plummeted 3,700 feet, nearly 3/4 of a mile straight down the rock face. To survive an extreme descent like that, you have to transfer the punishing burden of gravity away from your fragile brake pads and force the heavy steel of the engine block to carry the load. Reaching the valley floor brought immediate relief. The bitter, freezing winds of the summit vanished, replaced by the warmth of the lower elevation. Instead of dry rock, the track actually turned into a shallow running stream. Tucked into this gorge were structures you'd never expect to see. We found ancient stone watchtowers built seamlessly right into the rocky cliff faces. These massive pillars were designed to overlook and protect small, isolated villages nestled deep within the complex mountain range. When terrain requires a brutal, sheer cliff descent just to get there, it creates a natural barrier. The extreme geography acts as a shield, preserving indigenous architecture from the reach of modern development. We eventually navigated back up to the tarmac and pulled into a tiny lantern-lit outpost near Mecca. This is where Kamal and Muhammad's Arabic fluency really paid off. After a quick negotiation with a local Bedouin herdsman, the man got right to work, milking one of his camels directly into a metal bowl. Curious, drinking it raw is a unique sensory experience. It's surprisingly thin, far less fatty than cow's milk, and carries a dry, almost cardboard-like taste. Navigating the Saudi backcountry takes specific gear and raw mechanical physics just to survive the terrain. But mastering that geography is what allows you to reach the deep, enduring cultural roots hidden inside it. The modern Jeddah skyline is defined by glass and steel towers, entirely sealed off from the harsh Arabian environment. These structures allow residents to move between air-conditioned cars and air-conditioned malls, effectively masking the reality of the desert heat and the logistics of how people once survived here. To see the original methods of desert survival, we have to look at the footprint of the pre-1947 walled city, a district known as Balad. In Balad, every street and building was engineered to serve a specific survival purpose. Walking through these alleys shows how human ingenuity managed extreme temperatures and rigid social rules, long before the arrival of modern electricity. The district's engineering history is deep, anchored by structures like this mosque minaret, with foundations dating back to 700 AD. Surrounding it are multi-story homes built with the rugged, specialized wooden fixtures required for life in the ancient walled city. These enclosures, called Roshan balconies, are an engineered solution to the desert climate. The slats catch narrow breezes and funnel them inside for passive cooling. The latticework also allows residents to monitor the street without being seen, maintaining strict cultural privacy. These architectural features bridge the gap between the demands of the climate and the requirements of the law. At street level, the same focus on utility applies to the merchants and their traditional goods. This includes the gutra. While it is a staple of regional fashion, its design is rooted in desert technology. The fabric blocks the sun from the head and neck, while loose folds facilitate airflow around the wearer's skin. In an emergency, the ends wrap across the face to muffle the nose and mouth, filtering air during sandstorms. In Balad, traditional fashion functions as wearable environmental armor. Navigation here is sensory. You locate specific shops by following the smell of the spices rather than looking for signs. This hyper-local commerce creates its own challenges for outsiders, who may find it difficult to source Western items like nutmeg across a language barrier. The market is aggressive. Vendors compete for 5 rial sales, banging on blasts for your attention. The evening rush is monitored by religious police. They patrol the market to enforce modesty codes and identify forbidden behavior, including taking photographs. To avoid these tensions, many visitors shift their schedule to early Friday morning, when the shops are quiet and the streets are unpopulated. Survival in the souk requires mastering these cultural rhythms just as much as the physical environment. Modern Jeddah was built for convenience, but the ecosystem of Balad was built for adaptation. The value of the old city lies in this unbroken lineage of human ingenuity, a history that cannot be replicated in a modern retail chain. When architecture, clothing, and commerce all evolve together to solve the same environmental problems, they create a specific atmosphere that a shopping mall cannot duplicate. Balad remains relevant today as a physical record of how humans modify their world to remain comfortable in extreme conditions. And even in a place defined by its management of heat, the local culture still finds room for the unexpected, like a can of fake snow in December. Late 1990s in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The city is a dense commercial hub, heavily structured by concrete streets, bustling storefronts, and towering minarets. It is a highly regulated environment, especially for the thousands of foreign expatriates living there on corporate contracts. Yet every week, hundreds of these Western workers willingly evacuated this crowded skyline. They packed into off-road vehicles, driving straight past the city limits. Their destination was the open desert. It is an environment defined entirely by massive, sweeping sand dunes and sheer rock formations. It is completely barren. They weren't out there mapping terrain or surveying oil. They were wandering through the harsh scrub and sand, scanning the ground for white chalk marks, all in pursuit of sliced citrus and a cold drink. Moving across the globe to a vastly different culture creates intense isolation. Without your usual friends or familiar routines, you hit a psychological vacuum. You need a reliable way to plug into a community fast. For these expats, that gateway was a group called the Has House Harriers, a self-described drinking club with a running problem. The group traces its roots to early 20th century Kuala Lumpur, where British expats established a ritual of running to a local restaurant for a meal.
Over the decades, that localized Malaysian dining run morphed into a global network. For those living isolated in the Middle East, it served as an instant, pre-packaged survival mechanism. The weekly ritual always kicks off with the sharp blast of a bugle out in the sand. At that signal, the sprawling crowd gathers around a leader known as the Grand Master. He organizes the chaos, calling everyone to attention to brief them on the week's events and lay out the plan for future runs. While some chapters worldwide are highly competitive or adult-oriented, the Jeddah hash operated strictly as a family hash. It actively recruited all ages, welcoming casual walkers right alongside marathon runners. This setup creates a highly inclusive starting line. Whether you are a senior executive or a junior contractor, those corporate titles are deliberately stripped away the moment you step into the desert. Everyone is an equal participant. Success on the trail isn't measured by crossing a finish line first. It requires the collective effort of the group to navigate a path that is intentionally broken. The pack starts by following a continuous trail of white chalk drawn directly onto the dirt and rocks. But the trail is designed with specific obstacles. Soon, the line abruptly vanishes into a drawn circle. This is known as a check. At a check, the runners have to fan out blindly in every direction. They search the surrounding brush until someone spots where the true line resumes, calling the rest of the pack over to the new path. Then comes a more devious trap. The new trail might suddenly terminate at a circle marked with an X. This is a back check. It proves they have followed a false path all along. The entire pack is forced to reverse direction and track all the way back to the previous empty circle to try again. This specific backtracking mechanic serves as a physical equalizer for the entire group. Because the fastest runners hit the false trails first, they spend all their energy sprinting the wrong way. This stalling gives the slower walkers time to catch up and rejoin the main group. These markers force the pack to stay together. By design, the fastest runners are constantly pulled back into the orbits of the slowest walkers, ensuring the entire group arrives at the finish line at roughly the same time. Midway through the heat of the trail, the group hits the orange stop. It provides a vital rest period for water and citrus. Eventually, this break stretches out, transitioning the physical exertion into a massive desert campout as evening sets in. These gatherings scale up significantly for British holidays. In November, roughly 300 hashers would assemble for the Guy Fawkes hash. They would light glowing torches, dry striped sweaters, and build a massive bonfire right in the sand to burn effigies. By transplanting specific, fiery British traditions into the Saudi dunes, these expats physically manifest a piece of their home culture. It anchors them in a foreign land. But the expatriate life is inherently temporary. Eventually, a work contract ends, meaning a member has to leave this makeshift family they have relied on heavily. To send off departing members returning to their home countries, the club performs a gunging. It is a messy, affectionate physical punishment, where thick liquid is dumped directly over the person's head. The weekly drive into the desert appears to be an escape from the city, but it serves a more practical purpose. These runners are navigating their way toward a community that keeps them from drifting apart. The Has House Harriers serves as a portable mechanism for building a home anywhere in the world, independent of fitness or corporate rank. And since the network spans the globe, you can likely find your own local trail online.
The Southern Hejaz is defined by high-altitude, rugged mountain valleys. Stretching from Tabuk down to Al-Baha, this corridor along the western coast rises sharply from the sea, creating a landscape dominated by deep escarpments and steep peaks. In cities like Al-Baha, the environment remains wild. Hotels overlook deep escarpments where baboons gather to forage in the morning, often requiring guests to physically navigate past the primates to reach the hotel entrance. The history of the region is visible on the hillsides. Lining the winding mountain roads are towering stone structures built during the Ottoman era, Turkish watchtowers that still guard the approaches to the escarpment. Geographical anomalies appear throughout the range, such as the village of Di Ain. Built on a small mountain of white marble that glows at sunset, the village is supported by a permanent natural stream that feeds a lush grove of palm trees. This vibrant, high-altitude ecosystem serves as the starting point for the drive south. It establishes a landscape where ancient stone architecture sits alongside modern infrastructure, set against a backdrop of steep vertical terrain.
South of the Hejaz, the road enters the Asir region toward Abha. The city is the center of a large-scale national effort to build a modern tourism industry within the country's mountainous interior. A primary destination in this region is Habala, a hanging village constructed halfway down a sheer cliff. The settlement was designed as a fortress, built into the rock face to protect the inhabitants from Turkish patrols. Today, the approach to Habala features a paved parking lot, restaurants, and a small Ferris wheel. A cable car system now carries tourists down the cliff face, replacing the isolation of the original site with modern convenience. Before the cables were installed, the only way into the village was by rope. Residents lowered themselves down the vertical stone. If they were discovered, they could simply withdraw the lines to cut off all access to the settlement below. While these developments provide easy access to the ruins, they erase the protective isolation that once defined Habala. The village's history as a difficult refuge is difficult to reconcile with the amusement rides and parking lots now sitting at the cliff's edge. Leaving the manicured tourist centers behind reveals a local culture that operates firmly on its own terms. The basket souk in Abha is run by Saudi women who manage a social and competitive marketplace. They are talkative and direct, often moving between stalls to engage potential buyers and guide them through their collections. Their goods are hand-woven using local reeds and colorful vinyl. These baskets are famous throughout the Asir for being heavy-duty and functional, built for daily use rather than display. Further into the region, the town of Kamis Mushait hosts a silver souk known for traditional Bedouin jewelry. The town also serves as a major military installation, marking the transition into the high-security borderlands. These markets represent the active traditional trade of the Asir. They remain the final pockets of unbothered civilian commerce before the road reaches the restricted zones near the frontier. The 150-kilometer drive from Kamis Mushait to Nadran carries a shift in atmosphere as the highway approaches the border with Yemen. To maintain control over the border region, the government operates 6 consecutive military checkpoints along this road. Each stop requires the inspection of IDs, travel letters, and vehicle registrations before travelers can proceed toward Nadran. Arriving in Nadran brings the journey to a halt. Reaching the city just after noon means hitting the midday prayer closure, when the silver and gold souks lock their doors for several hours. During this lockdown, the Prince Turki Almani Palace offers a rare look at Najran's architecture. The palace is built from layered mud and clay, featuring intricate white trim that gives the massive structure a delicate, gingerbread-like appearance. The multi-hour delay in this guarded border town forces a spontaneous decision. Instead of waiting for the markets to reopen, the travelers point the car east toward Sharora to see the terrain change firsthand. The highway toward Sharora serves as the final link to civilization. This outpost is the last stop before the Rub al Khali, where the road eventually ends and the sand begins. As the car moves away from Najran, the landscape undergoes a systematic stripping of detail. The houses and buildings fade away, leaving only scattered trees amidst the developing sand. The geography continues to simplify. The trees shrink into small shrubs, which eventually give way to patches of thin grass along the asphalt's edge. Finally, all vegetation disappears. The road enters an environment consisting entirely of sand, an ocean of towering dunes stretching for 1,000 miles. This is the edge of the empty quarter, a place where there are no rocks, no plants, and no landmarks. Standing at the edge of this absolute void provides the sense of isolation that was missing from the tourist sites. Out here, the landscape is pure and indifferent to the presence of the road. The return trip requires a multi-hour night drive from the borderlands, moving back through the mountain passes toward Jeddah. Near Mecca, a dense sandstorm forces the multi-lane highway to a crawl. Visibility drops to the length of a few cars as thick clouds of sand engulf the traffic and bring the journey to a near-total halt. Saudi Arabia continues to invest in cable cars, high-end hotels, and modern infrastructure to bridge these distances. Yet, the sudden arrival of a sandstorm, or the absolute silence of the dunes, proves that the environment still dictates the terms of the journey. In April of 2000, a group of travelers set off into the winding heights of Saudi Arabia's Harithi Escarpment. This is an environment that actively resists visitors. The group was a convoy of international expats, 7 people spanning from New Zealand to Wales, looking to test their mettle in an environment far removed from their daily lives. They came heavily prepared. The rolling hills required constant shifting into 4-wheel drive low, and the group relied on walkie-talkies, sneaked past customs as children's toys, to coordinate their movements over the rough terrain. The travelers viewed the escarpment as a classic obstacle course, treating the trip as a man versus wild conquest through a hostile, uninhabited landscape. But the landscape quickly proved uncooperative. The scattered remains of a tarmac road completely vanished, leaving the vehicles to rock back and forth over the punishing ridges. Progress came to a sudden halt when a brand new tire on one of the vehicles was destroyed by the jagged rocks. As they struggled with the repair in this desolate stretch of hills, a local Egyptian man named Ali appeared from the brush to help them. That flat tire halted the group's momentum and revealed a simple truth: they weren't alone in this wilderness. Any initial tension vanished when Ali produced a rifle and set up a target 50 meters away and invited the group to take a few shots. A brief, impromptu shooting competition sparked an immediate camaraderie. With the tire patched, the convoy pushed further in, squeezing past concrete homes and eventually setting up camp on the remnants of massive 5-tiered step farms carved directly into the mountain. Ali returned to the campsite later that afternoon, bringing the group a handful of pink roses. These remote mountains hide a specialized economy. Ali worked on a nearby farm dedicated to cultivating these roses, distilling them into concentrated oils that are often valued more highly than gold. The campsite sat in the middle of a functioning, high-value agricultural zone, sustained by local labor. The next morning, the group set their sights on the physical goal of their trip, a grueling ascent up Mount Umaresh. They approached the climb prepared, strapping on heavy-duty boots and loading packs with survival water. Halfway up the steep incline, Ali began the climb behind them. He quickly caught up to the struggling group. Carrying no gear and wearing only simple rubber flip-flops, he blew past the heavily equipped expats to reach the summit first. The expensive, specialized gear the group relied on only slowed them down, leaving them entirely humbled by a man who treated the extreme terrain as a casual walk. After the climb, the group gathered at Ali's home at the bottom of the escarpment for a final cup of tea. Over tea, he shared photographs of his new wife and spoke about the months of separation required to work the rose harvests. Ali's journey mirrors a common pattern in the region. He had traveled from the Nile Delta in Egypt, crossing the Red Sea to reach this remote corner of Saudi Arabia, trading the proximity of his family for the solitude of the rose farms. Ali hadn't followed the group up the mountain to admire their gear or their mission. In an environment defined by deep isolation, he was simply looking for basic human company. Reaching the top of Mount Umaresh was a physical achievement, but the expedition's final impression came from the enduring, quiet lives found in the shadows of the peaks. If you want to travel between the Saudi Arabian cities of Taif and Al-Baha, you must choose between 2 highly distinct paths. One route is designed for sightseeing. It's a slow, winding, scenic mountain drive, deliberately marked by ancient architecture and stone watchtowers. The other option gets you there faster. It's a utilitarian highway, built for travelers who want to escape the hustle of city life in places like Jeddah as quickly as possible. Modern infrastructure forces travelers into this binary choice: speed or curated sightseeing. But choosing either path means completely ignoring the massive, untamed landscape trapped right in the middle. In May of 2000, a small convoy of international expats from Ireland, Scotland, South Africa, and Australia met up at the Taif Escarpment to escape the city. After a quick cup of tea at the top of the ridge, we started our descent down the fast paved highway toward Al-Baha. But halfway down the mountain, we made a hard turn. We abandoned the asphalt entirely, pointing our 4-wheel drives off the edge of the map and directly into the cross-country terrain. Our objective was Wadi Turabah. It is a sprawling, unmapped valley sitting completely isolated between those 2 main human thoroughfares. Leaving the safety of the pavement is the only way to test what kind of ecosystems actually manage to exist out there, far past our controlled transit corridors. The physical reality of off-roading hits you immediately. Navigating the wadi required wrestling the vehicles over harsh, rocky patches, forcing the engines to roar violently against the landscape. But then the terrain breaks. The violent shaking gives way to smooth, sandy tracks. Suddenly, you look out the window and find scattered pockets of standing water feeding dense patches of green vegetation. Inside the valley floor, the flora defies the dry sand. We navigated past prickly desert thistles and solitary acacia trees standing right in the middle of the arid expanse. The fauna is even stranger. We watched hummingbirds darting through the brush and, looking up, found entire herds of goats balancing precariously in the branches of the trees to graze. The wadi functions like an isolated ecological pocket. Without human interference, life out here adapts in highly unorthodox ways simply to survive. As we pressed deeper into the valley, we passed a few isolated farms. Before long, a group of young Bedouins followed our tracks out from one of the properties. We rolled to a stop. They walked right up to our window, whipped out a camera, snapped a blinding flash photo of our friend Cass, and instantly took off. Finding luxury consumer technology out here was a jarring collision of worlds. We were miles away from any photo processing lab, let alone a reliable internet connection. By nightfall, we set up camp to throw a 30th birthday party for our friend Mary. Soon, loud pop music was echoing off the canyon walls. Even when you try to escape civilization, human presence inevitably injects the loud, electronic noise of the modern world into the most isolated natural sanctuaries. Later that evening, I grabbed a flashlight and walked a fair distance away from the campfire to answer the call of nature in total physical privacy. I clicked the flashlight off. The thumping bass of the car stereo faded into a faint echo, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. My eyes slowly adjusted until the rocky desert was bathed in a soft, ominous moonlight. Then I heard footsteps heading my way in the dark. They weren't the fast, deliberate strides of a camper looking for me. They were slow, casual, carefree. I squinted into the dark, expecting a predator. Instead, two massive camels stepped into the moonlight, walking side by side. Camels are usually herd animals. But here were just two of them, a male and a female, taking a quiet, unbothered midnight stroll together, without a herd in sight. Watching them drift past, the mechanical roar of our engines and the blinding camera flashes washed away. It left behind only the quiet, romantic character of a valley at rest. By morning, the rest of the herd had found us. 7 more camels and a sprawling herd of goats were hanging around our camp. Standing next to them against the canyon walls, you realize exactly how physically small you are. We packed up our gear for the final leg of the journey, climbing our way out of the wadi's basin until we reconnected with the paved tourist road. Instantly, human history reasserted itself. We were greeted by the thick stone walls and wooden walkways of the ancient watchtowers guarding our exit route. You can drive the fast road, or you can drive the scenic road. But to gain true perspective on the scale of nature, you have to step out of the established human corridors and briefly surrender to the untamed spaces sitting quietly in between.
It's late June in Saudi Arabia, and the midday heat is so intense you can physically see it shimmering off the sand, which makes you wonder why an entire natural history society would voluntarily pack a 14-car convoy and drive 2 hours out into that blistering desert environment. They were heading for a remote stretch of sand called Rabigh Beach. To reach it, you have to drive straight past a massive industrial oil refinery until civilization simply drops away. But the moment you look out over the water, the agonizing drive makes sense. The sea shifts in massive watercolor bands of color, from green to deep blue to green again. It looks like the perfect summer getaway. Yet, if you look up and down the coastline, you'll notice that this beautiful beach is entirely abandoned. That isolation is by design. The Red Sea coastline is highly deceptive. What appears to be an idyllic, inviting surface actually conceals a rugged ecosystem that actively punishes an unprepared human body.
If you want to walk into that water, you have to strap on thick fin boots. Even then, you need intense balance to navigate the crashing waves and the incredibly uneven terrain hiding beneath the foam. Beneath the surface sits a dense, jagged, and unforgiving architecture of coral reef. A slight slip or a clumsy swimming maneuver guarantees your bare flesh is going to hit something sharp. Our narrator found this out the hard way, slipping while swimming and coming away with a severe, deep scrape right below the wrist. These reefs are massive colonies of living polyps. If a fragment gets embedded under your skin, these tiny organisms can survive and grow inside your tissue. You must treat the wound immediately, neutralizing the organism before it colonizes. The required first aid is essentially improvised chemical warfare. You have to scrub the scrape gown with heavy iodine, acidic vinegar, or, if that's all you brought, aerosol right guard deodorant to kill whatever is trying to take root. Surviving here requires a shift in perspective. You are not visiting a landscape. You are entering a living organism that demands your absolute caution. Back on the sand, the isolation sets in. There are no other tourists, no resorts, and no modern conveniences anywhere in sight. The only reminder of the outside world comes from a lone Coast Guard soldier. Bored out of his mind on an empty beach, he stops by the camp to meticulously read through every single line of the group's paperwork, simply for something to do. He patrols the coast in a rugged 1952 Land Cruiser, his teeth clearly rotting from years without access to a dentist. Yet, while the humans out here clearly struggle with the environment, the native ecosystem absolutely thrives. With 0 beachgoers to pick the shoreline clean, you can find dozens of pristine, untouched shells just washing up on the sand. The beach is packed with bizarre communities of crabs that look like something out of an alien movie. And as evening rolls in, wandering herds of camels casually stroll through the campsite, treating the area as their own domain. The sheer abundance of this wildlife proves that the environment isn't broken, it's perfectly balanced. It is only the invading humans who find it so painfully hostile. By Friday morning, the initial adrenaline of discovery completely fades, and the physical reality of the expedition finally hits. A day spent snorkeling under a magnifying glass of salt water and desert air leaves the campers radiating with severe, agonizing sunburns. The heat becomes entirely overwhelming. After spending the morning hiding under a canvas shelter to escape the elements, the campers finally surrender. Barely 2 hours into the day, they pack up the convoy and flee back to civilization for the sweet relief of air conditioning. It raises the question, is a painful coral scrape, chemical wound scrub, and blistering sunburn actually worth a few fleeting hours in the water? Rabigh Beach offers a raw, uncurated natural wonder, existing entirely outside the sanitized boundaries of a typical tourist attraction. Experiencing that kind of pure, mesmerizing beauty exacts a steep physical toll. Surviving it requires careful preparation, deep respect, and a very healthy fear of the world's most alluring environments. Thick clouds of dirt surge into the air as massive hooves hammer against the track, fighting for the inside rail. It is August 2000 in Taif, Saudi Arabia. The tension at the starting line is driven by stakes having nothing to do with traditional trophies. During the peak of summer, the coastal city of Jeddah becomes an absolute oven. To escape the heat, thousands migrate to the higher elevations of Taif, where the mountain air provides the only relief from the crushing humidity below. Every other week between mid-July and early September, this crowd gathers for a high-stakes migration of its own. Competitors travel from across the region, many coming from as far away as Sudan, lured by the top prizes, brand-new pickup trucks and four-wheel drive vehicles. Most spectators associate animal racing with a very specific environment: manicured grass, tiered grandstands, and professional adult jockeys navigating a high-speed sprint. The Taif camel races operate without any of those familiar boundaries. In this environment, the massive economic incentives and the lack of standard racing regulations create a sport dictated entirely by the extremes of the desert. This diagram compares two different worlds. A standard thoroughbred sprint covers 2 miles, while the Taif circuit is a sprawling 10-kilometer loop. Because the start is near the 2-kilometer mark, the camels sustain a full gallop across 8 kilometers of open desert. This grueling endurance test forces the animals into stretches of the track miles away from any fixed observation point. This distance makes a traditional finish line grandstand functionally useless. Within moments of the start, the animals vanish into the horizon, leaving the spectators behind. To solve this, the track was designed with a specific mechanical workaround, an interior road, 5 to 6 lanes wide, built solely to accommodate a massive caravan of spectator vehicles. As the race begins, hundreds of 4WD vehicles aggressively pace the animals at high speeds. It becomes a parallel motorized race, with drivers swerving through the dust to avoid massive pileups just feet away from the camels. The sheer geographical scale of the course effectively turns the audience into participants. Spectating is no longer a passive act. It's a dangerous, high-speed rally that mirrors the intensity of the race itself. Eventually, the vehicles and animals reach the final stretch, where the exhaustion of the 10-kilometer marathon is etched into the movement of every competitor. At the finish line, the scale of the riders finally becomes clear. These are not professional athletes. They are children, 5 and 6 years old, dwarfed by the massive animals they've just guided across the desert. Maintaining a grip on a galloping camel for several miles is a massive physical burden for a child of that size. To ensure they stay mounted, some competitors use the extreme tactic of physically tying the children down to the saddles. By the summer of 2000, racing circuits in Dubai had already banned the practice of tying down riders. However, in the regulatory vacuum of the Taif races, the tactic remained a standard part of the strategy. When a life-changing prize like a new truck is on the line, the pressure to cut weight and stay mounted is absolute. These incentives drive participants to exploit the most vulnerable human elements to secure a win. By the time the final race of the day approaches, the weather begins to shift. The rare morning rain is long gone, replaced by a violent wind that begins to sweep across the track. Within minutes, a blinding sandstorm envelops the starting gate. Visibility drops until the track itself disappears into a thick orange haze, just as the animals are being loaded into position. While the spectators and drivers struggle to see through the grit, the camels remain entirely still. They wait in the center of the storm, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around them. The wind drops to a dull roar just as the gates open. The camels surge forward, instantly swallowed by the thick wall of sand as they begin their final 8-kilometer sprint into the haze. The Taif races of 2000 exist as a raw look at a sport pushed to its limits. It was a moment where biological endurance, unchecked ambition, and the sudden violence of the desert environment all collided at once.
Mention world-class coral reefs, and the mind immediately jumps to Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Accessing ecosystems on that scale usually requires heavy logistics. You have to book expensive charter boats and endure hours on the open sea just to reach the marine life. But tucked away in the Middle East, off the coast of cities like Jeddah and Yanbu, is an underwater ecosystem that directly rivals those famous Australian sites. The defining feature of this specific environment is its immediate accessibility. You can leave the boat behind entirely. Because of the unique geology near Yanbu, you can spot the exact edge of the reef by looking for the sudden shift in water color, sitting literally steps away from the dry sand. This geographical quirk completely removes the traditional barriers to entry. You can wake up at a desert campsite, walk straight into the ocean, and instantly find yourself inside a thriving marine habitat. Dip below the surface, and that barren, rocky desert cliff instantly gives way to an explosion of biology. The shallow water is crowded with soft anemones, giant clams, and bright blue parrotfish feeding in the sunlight. Look down at the sandy stretches right next to the coral formations, and you can easily spot larger animals navigating the shallows, like this spotted eagle ray gliding across the seabed. The water here is so welcoming that local residents and hospital workers out of Jeddah make casual monthly routines out of exploring sites like the Champagne Reef. In these bright shallows, anyone can snap a decent photo with a simple, weather-resistant Minolta point-and-shoot. Documenting anything deeper, however, introduces a severe physical constraint. The surface functions like an effortless sunlit aquarium,
but venturing deeper into the water forces both the divers and their equipment to adapt to a much harsher environment. Moving further off the coast into mid-water depths means leaving the snorkel gear behind and strapping on a scuba tank. This bathymetric depth chart shows exactly how light behaves as it penetrates the ocean. Notice how the red and orange bands of the color spectrum are completely absorbed by the water, fading out as the depth increases. Because the sea literally filters out these warm colors as you descend into the scuba zone, a standard weather camera is rendered completely useless. It will produce nothing but washed-out, monochromatic blue images. To capture accurate imagery under these conditions, serious divers turn to specialized, sealed mechanical hardware, like the vintage Nikonos 5. Mastering that technical learning curve pays off. It allows you to document the staggering density of life waiting in the midwater, like these bright orange anthias fish swarming around the dive team. This zone requires you to stop being a passive observer. You have to actively counter the physics of the sea to capture its actual vibrancy. Eventually, exploring the full scope of the Red Sea requires a full-day excursion into the darker, highly unpredictable open water. Out here, you find a dark contradiction. The exact same massive coral structures that nurture marine life act as devastating geological hazards to human engineering. Follow the reef wall down a dramatic 90-foot drop to the seafloor, and you find the final destination of the Ana'an, a massive ship torn open by the jagged coral. The scale of the wreck is imposing. The ship stretches hundreds of feet long across the sand, anchored by a towering 10-foot-tall propeller. It is a jarring psychological shift. You leave behind the bright, colorful aquarium of the shoreline and arrive in a silent, shadowy graveyard at the bottom of the ocean. A single day's descent in the Red Sea exposes an uncompromising environment. You witness nature acting first as a flourishing creator and then, resting quietly in the dark, as a formidable destroyer.
Tracing the historical route from Jeddah to Medina, the same path famously traveled by T.E. Lawrence, requires crossing some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Before airplanes crossed these skies, tens of thousands of travelers made this massive, grueling journey through the heat for the annual Hajj pilgrimage. Moving that many people across deep sand required immense logistical support, almost entirely shouldered by camels carrying heavy wooden passenger litters. To keep these massive caravans alive, a string of bustling way stations and markets sprang up between Medina and Mecca, providing food, water, and rest for weary travelers. If you were making this trek a century ago, your survival depended entirely on reaching these specific fixed points of commerce scattered across a lethal map. Today, if you try to trace that exact same route, those vibrant markets are entirely gone. Take the old Haji Market. Its mud brick walls have been crumbling into the sand for 50 years, leaving nothing but hollow, abandoned structures behind. The widespread adoption of commercial airplanes and modern paved highways simply bypassed these ancient stops, moving people faster and further. We now cross this landscape at speeds the ancient pilgrims couldn't imagine, yet we do so without the network of physical way stations that once guaranteed their survival. The physical safety nets have vanished, yet the intense heat and isolation of the desert remain exactly as harsh as they were a century ago. Finding a bit of shelter between the crumbling walls, our modern convoys set up camp right in the middle of the old Haji Market's ruins. We quickly realized the area wasn't totally abandoned. Local kids, out on a week-long school holiday, were running through the ruins. Surrounding our tents were dozens of camels, actively roaming the same paths their ancestors walked 100 years ago. The brick-and-mortar shops may have collapsed into dust, but the local ecosystem and the wandering populations are still very much alive. Shortly after we arrived, members of the local Subi and Rahali tribes spotted our camp and approached us. Without any hesitation, they presented us with fresh Arabic coffee and a massive communal plate of lamb and rice. This gesture follows a rigid, unwritten code of Bedouin hospitality, established as a mandatory survival mechanic for anyone crossing the sands. Because of the historical life-or-death stakes attached to sharing resources here, refusing their food would be taken as a severe insult.
The human safety net remains fully operational, providing the same essential protection to modern campers that these tribes once offered to the Hajj caravans. At dawn the next morning, we packed our gear and drove deeper into the sand, aiming for a small village called Ash-Shufaya. The historical trail was quickly replaced by stark markers of modern industry, as we found ourselves navigating directly alongside the massive Yanbu steel pipeline. Then, the modern machinery began to fail. In our small convoy of 6 cars, 3 vehicles suffered flat tires almost simultaneously. This standard wheel hub relies on multiple lug nut studs. By applying too much torque, 3 snapped completely off. With only a fraction remaining, the wheel loses stability. Driving on it causes a severe wobble that will detach the tire entirely. Despite our combustion engines and GPS, one broken piece of metal rendered a modern 4x4 just as immobile and vulnerable to the heat as an exhausted camel. We weren't getting out of there using a piece of technology. We needed human expertise. Luckily, one of the passengers in my vehicle was an expert mechanic. He stepped in, carefully secured the remaining lug nuts without snapping them, and got the tire mounted safely. Beyond his individual skill, we had the structural safety net of the 6-car convoy itself, guaranteeing that a crippled vehicle wouldn't result in anyone being left behind. We might have been using steel wrenches and 4-wheel drive instead of camel litters, but the operating principle was identical to the ancient Bedouin tradition we experienced the day before: mutual reliance. Airplanes and modern pipelines have certainly changed the mechanics of crossing the Arabian desert, but true survival here still relies on community, hospitality, and the timeless rule that you never travel alone. If you were to drive through the Saudi Arabian interior in early 2001, you would see a landscape that appears entirely finished. It is a vast, high-heat environment where surface water simply isn't part of the map. I had lived in the kingdom for years, but this was my final 24 hours before leaving the country for good. I had 1 day left to see something I had missed during my time there. My goal wasn't a major city or a coastal resort, but a specific coordinate 30 kilometers inland from the town of Al Lith. Even in Jeddah, a city only a few hours away, the people I knew had never heard of this place. It existed only in the geography of the local tribes and a few specialized natural history groups. Because I had already sold my Land Cruiser in preparation for my move, my friend Kamal Abdallah, who had been my partner on many of these desert adventures, offered me a lift in his own truck. I wanted my last memory of the desert to be something beyond the expected sand and rock. I wanted to find the one place where the desert's rules about water and life didn't seem to apply. Arriving at Wadi Al Lith is a physical jolt. You step out of the heat and find a running river, a small stream that continues to flow even in the middle of a Saudi summer. It's not from rainfall. An underground thermal stream pushes scalding groundwater up through the crust. At the origin, it burns, but mixing with surface air and side channels, it cools into different zones, creating natural hot baths. The local communities have used these waters for generations, traveling inland because they believe the specific mineral heat of the spring can heal physical ailments. This specific geothermal arrangement creates a constant supply of moisture and heat, allowing the canyon to support biological life that cannot exist anywhere else in the surrounding miles. Because the water never stops flowing, the sand gives way to thick green moss that coats the rocks along the bank. In the clear pools between the moss, you can see small fish and frogs. They live in a permanent aquatic state, completely isolated from any other body of water. The area also attracts rare insects that stand out against the brown rock, including blue dragonflies, bright yellow ones, and even red. During our visit, a large flock of herons stayed with us, moving from one side of the wadi to the other. Their presence alone shows just how much water is actually moving through this canyon. Even the local camels take advantage of the anomaly, leaving the dunes to graze on the tall grass that grows thick along the wadi's edge. The wadi is a playground for local kids, who spend their afternoons doing flips from the rocky ledges into the deeper pools of the stream. Access to the site is changing. Where there used to be only a dirt track, there is now a tarmac road, as the people living near Al Lith begin to promote the springs to a wider audience. This canyon manages to hold a massive amount of biological and human activity in a space that should be a void. It is a pocket of extreme density in the middle of the desert silence. As the sun began to drop, our convoy tried to take an off-road shortcut back toward the coast, hoping to reach Wahba Beach before heading north to Jeddah. The desert quickly reminded us why it is usually left empty. The two-wheel drive cars in our group were immediately buried in the soft sand, unable to make it more than a few hundred yards. Kamal had to spend the next hour winching the stranded cars out of the drifts one by one, forcing us to abandon our shortcut and head back to the safety of the main road. We were in a race against the light, driving hard to reach the pavement before the sun vanished and left us navigating the dunes in total darkness. This was the last sunset I would see over the Saudi desert. It was the end of a long series of adventures in a country that had become home. The desert is easy to dismiss as a wasteland until you've spent years finding the improbable cracks where life actually takes hold. It is those rare moments of finding water where there shouldn't be any that make the final drive away feel like a genuine loss.